switch. Paid for by people like you. I don't care what you say. I don't care what you do. No, 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 I don't care. No, no, I don't care. As you can see, I don't care. No, no, I'm not gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living. No, no, never gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living. I take home an arm's wage. I paid for a people like you. I don't care what you say. I don't care what you do now. No, no, I don't care. No, no, I don't care. As you can see, I don't care. No, no, I'm not gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living. No, no, never gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living. I take home an arm's wage, and I take it every day. Your idea of work is my idea of pay. No, no, I'm not gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living. No, no, never gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living.
All right, so welcome to the old Abbey Tap House Radio. My name's John, and I'm using these sessions to explore a question that I'm interested in. And that question is, how do people who are working in an arts environment go about earning their living? So today, I'm going to be talking to a friend of mine called David Gledhill. And as usual, I'm going to let David introduce himself. So over to you, Dave.
Hi, John. Yeah, I'm David Gledhill. I suppose first and foremost, I'm a self-employed visual artist and have been self-employed as a visual artist on and off for about 40 years. But I'm also now one of the directors of Rogue Artist Studios in Manchester, which is a large studio group of about 80 artists based in a Victorian school in East Manchester. So that's the second thing I'm involved with. And then thirdly, I'm also a part-time lecturer in fine art at the University of Bolton. So part of my week is spent up there teaching on the BA and MA fine art courses. So it's a mixed week, a mixed menu.
Very good. So one of the, in the title of the discussion is arts environment. So how would you describe the arts environment that you operate in? How would you summarize it? I know you've got 3 different functions within that environment, but what is the environment overall, do you think?
Well, I suppose they all feed in and out of one another, really. But I guess the overall field I'm involved in is the visual arts. I am personally a painter. That's my preferred or favorite medium. I've worked a little bit in film and a tiny bit with printmaking as well, but basically I'm a painter, and visual arts is my field and has been going back to when I graduated in the early 80s, about 1981. But I think more broadly speaking, and the way I tend to describe this to anyone who'll listen to me for long enough, is I think there's a distinction that needs to be drawn between, and this is something you need to think about when you're very young, going into any kind of creative field, is you need to decide for yourself whether you want to be nationally or internationally known in that field, you know, exceptional in that field, fully professional, or whether you want a life in that art form. And that's the distinction I tend to draw between a career or a high-flying professional career in one art form, or a life in the arts centered on that form. So, you know, for me, teaching and running the group studio are all part of a life in the arts. It's not just about 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, standing at the easel, making paintings. So I always wanted a fuller involvement than a professional career in painting would allow me. I didn't want to be locked away in my studio like Lucian Freud or any other notable artists, you know, and dealing with business that attaches to that profession. I wanted a much fuller involvement socially than that would enable me to do. So I think that's an interesting distinction. You're either you know, you want to be a high-flying professional with an international career in the arts, or you want to have a life in the arts, to be engaged in lots of different ways in an art form.
And was that something that you had in mind in 1981 as you were leaving your degree? Or
well, no, I mean,
is that something that's coalesced throughout?
That's coalesced. You could call it a rationalising of your failures. You know, if you can't make it as an internationally famous artist, then make the best of just being in the arts somehow in any capacity. But I kind of I realised as well that, you know, over the course of the last 40 years, I realised that if it's important to you to have the maximum amount of creative freedom in an art form that you're practicing, and you don't want to have to consider commercial aspects of that form, then it's going to be harder to develop a career on the basis of purely pursuing that one form. So, you know, you may have to earn a living in some other area to support that personal creative freedom that you have, whether you're a musician or an actor or a visual artist or whatever you're doing. You know, there's such a thing in the arts as the conversation. It's what's happening in an art form at a national and international level. What sort of themes are being addressed? What sort of work is being made? If you want a much broader sense of creative freedom, if you want to work outside of the conversation, if you want to investigate obscure forms of practice that may be consensually regarded as outmoded, you know, 17th, 18th, 19th century idioms or styles of working, then, you know, you may find that you need to supplement your income somehow along the way. And that's certainly happened to me, and something that's dawned on me in the last 10 or 15 years, really. You know, the more creative freedom you want, the more you're going to have to box clever about supporting your practice somehow.
Yeah. Because, well, not traditionally, but in the past, artists have had a patron, haven't they? So they've found somebody to solve all those day-to-day financial problems for them, and in return they've produced the work. I don't know, how does patronage work? Do they, I know, well, with the
various forms of it, you know, there was aristocratic patronage, royal patronage, church patronage, like you say, and that system kind of survived through to kind of, I guess, the early mid-19th century, and then that was replaced by more occasional forms of patronage from wealthy upper middle class, shall we say, entrepreneurs who took over from the aristocracies, patrons of the arts, you know, after that died out a bit. But obviously, you know, a lot of artists thrived under patronage and produced incredible work. Vermeer is an example, and you know, there's been a play on the radio and a film recently about his famous painting of the girl with the pearl earring, you know, and all his work was bought and paid for by one patron, so far as I can tell. But he still managed to produce extraordinary paintings. So, and it's the case today that, you know, I'm very lucky in that my own work is collected by a couple of people, you know, and that's fantastic. But, you know, if you want to work outside of any editorial control, you know, if you don't want to consider scale, subject matter, or have that prescribed to you by anybody or by a market in the abstract sense, you know, if you don't want to have to produce work that's pleasing to some kind of market, then the chances of you you know, acquiring a patron or a regular buyer of your work or supporter of your work are reduced incrementally. I mean, there's ways of maximizing your chance of selling work in any medium, and then there's ways of minimizing it, you know, particularly in painting. You know, people have certain qualities that they're looking for in painting. They like color, they like, you know, a sort of positivity and optimism in painting. They like paintings that kind of can be hung at home, can be collected and hung in the home, and that remind them of certain situations they've lived through. And the more you eliminate those aspects from what you produce, the less chance you've got of finding a market for what you do. So it's a tricky balancing act, really, you know. But I was lucky to get a bit of teaching, just to bring one of my other threads into this, at a point where my work was on a cusp, really, between potentially being consumable to some extent, but also having other potential in it to be a little bit more challenging, perhaps, or difficult. And because the teaching came in at that point, luckily, I kind of went with the more difficult path. So I tend to produce work mostly on a large scale, and often, you know, looking at sort of quite difficult subject matter, historical subject matter that's not necessarily going to appeal straight away to a market. So in my own case, you know, having the teaching job has enabled me to sustain a certain kind of personal freedom and follow my own path much more determinedly.
Okay. So there's a couple of things there that I want to chase up. One of them is your subject matter. But before that, what pick up on something you said before that, of how a painting itself has a function for the person who hangs it in their home or owns it. And that function may be different to the needs and desires of the artist who wants to produce some work.
Yeah.
So I had in my mind, when you said it, it's almost like a sliding scale of where you situate yourself on there, whether or not you're producing stuff aimed at the picture owner, hanging them in their house, or whether it's to do with your personal freedom to produce what you want, regardless of whether or not somebody's going to buy it to hang up in their house.
Yeah. I think there's some truth in that. You know, I mean, you've got a picture there behind you on the wall that I can see that has a very kind of pleasing but definable aesthetic. You know, a single figure in a grey landscape, urban landscape. It looks like it's got sort of a sense of history involved in it, but also a sense of kind of, you know, the individual encountering a historical location. That's just the photo I can see behind your head, you know, and it's of a domestic scale. It's nicely framed and presented, and presumably when you look at it, you know, it reminds you of something, or it's evocative of something you've felt or experienced in the past. And that's a completely understandable impulse on the part of people who buy and collect pictures, or just have a few pictures, or even just one. Perhaps it's a picture that their own kids have done, you know. I understand completely that, you know, what people look for in pictures might be what they look for in a pleasant garden in the summer, you know, with the flowers in bloom, with birds flying, you know, and obviously Impressionism and the forms of art that have addressed those subjects are still very popular with people. But at the same time, if your sort of sensibility, your sentimental education, as it were, has brought you to a different place, and those sort of things don't necessarily resonate with you as an artist, those subjects, you might want to address something that's altogether less appealing. Like in my case, I've just recently completed a project that's about the Holocaust, you know, and I didn't experience it. None of my extended family have experienced anything like that. But the material I was working with, which in this case was ordinary snapshots taken by German citizens in occupied Poland in the 40s, suggested, you know, was rooted in that period of history. So I was interested in their perspective, as in that particular case, they were German administrators working in Poland. I was interested in how they experienced or how they looked at that historical scenario. So my painted versions of these snapshots were on a colossal scale, you know, and the subject matter was deeply, horrifically disturbing. Not that it was depicted directly in the paintings, you know, but it was the time and place when these appalling events happened. So that's not that's not something that people are going to want to hang at home. But my experience as an artist, and going to museums and looking at collections of art and looking at a great range of painting, I've seen that those sorts of subjects have been addressed by artists in the past. And I've felt, part of a community with those artists that wanted to convey those subjects. Now, those artists, historical artists like, Goya or Manet, may have struggled to dispose of those paintings, may not have been commissioned, may have produced them privately, may not have sold them, they may have been banned by authorities, and they may have found their way to museums circuitously. But those paintings, some of those paintings to me are pinnacles of human achievement in the arts. So, I want to somehow, have a shot at that kind of degree of sophistication, power, and impact that those artists achieved in their work. And it would chuff me to bits to sell paintings, on a weekly basis. But I don't want to do that more than I want to have a go at making something, multi-layered, and dare I say it, with a bit of meaning built into it. Not that you can't have meaning in a small landscape. That's my, the subjects that interest me aren't immediately consumable in that way.
So the way you describe it is a little bit reminds me of something like a research project.
Yeah.
You were engaging with material and subject matter, but also materials as a way of exploring an idea. And the outcome is presumably you coming to some kind of understanding in relation to the initial question that you had when you entered the process. Is that
yeah.
Is that a good?
It's not quite as not. It's as an equation, that is very plausible and would be workable to fit the situation of the work I'm producing, but it's not exactly how it happens. It's much more complex than that. And for example, I suppose I'm talking about the last 5 or 10 years worth of the work I've made. And I have been doing a PhD, as you know, for the past 6 years, and that's just finished. And there's nothing to say that my work won't head off in a completely different direction. But you're right to say that it's been research driven. But as well as that, I've always collected secondhand snapshots, for a long, long time. And like anybody of my age, maybe 50 plus, I've got a box of black and white family photographs, which have always fascinated me as well, of the north of England in the 40s and even further back, when my parents were young. So it wasn't a case of setting myself a question, then acquiring the materials to produce, an investigation of it, and then concluding it. It was a coalescing of various threads of my activity as a person and an artist. And then the threads get twisted and then unraveled and retwisted. So I had these photographs. I was doing a PhD. I thought, shall I try and use these photographs to make some work? Because I need to make some work here. And then you make some work tentatively. You research similar work by contemporary artists. You research some of the ideas that are involved in painting from photographs, for example. Some of the theories and the concepts and books. Then you reconsider the work you've produced in the light of those theories and the work of the other artists. Then you take it further and more confidently in another direction. So it's a kind of like a dust devil, or like a little kind of tornado of stuff you've got to hand, ideas you have, books you've read, other artists' work you've seen. And that's really how it is right through a sort of involvement in an art form, I think. You're always looking at other practitioners, pinching their best ideas if you can, repurposing them, adapting them, taking their achievement as a standard of aspiration for yourself. And then you look at what you've got. You may have to go out and collect more stuff, whatever it is, your own photos, snapshots, anything that you're working with, stats, text, sheet music, could be absolutely anything, x-rays. You may need to go out and investigate another source of inspirational material. But then you bring that into that tornado and it gets assimilated in, and hopefully the work gets stronger and more layered and more interesting. So it's not a simple equation, and it's not a linear process, because things predate the process beginning,
Yeah. And the thing that came out there was that you are very much part of the process. So it's not a pure research process that's separate from you
No.
and you're the researcher. It's influencing you, you're influencing it, and there's no direct control over where it's going.
That's right.
It's not thing changes everything else.
It's not a disinterested form of inquiry like medical science or engineering or mathematics. You are implicated as the originator of the dynamism that brings all these things into play. You're the one that gets up in the morning, goes to the studio, looks at this stuff, and then tries to make something from it. And then the next day you think, this is terrible, I've gone in the wrong direction. And then you have another go the following day, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah.
So, and that's another challenge. You've got to integrate yourself as the originator of the work somehow into the work. You've got to let the viewer know that, you're not peddling some sort of objective set of data here. It's a partial, laterally glimpsed kind of compromised, mediated point of view put out there by one person to see if anyone picks up on it.
Yeah. All right. So just could you give us a potted David Gledhill history of how your career has unfolded?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking back over kind of 40 years since I graduated,
Yeah.
And it's like I was saying at the top, if I'd wanted a high-flying career in painting, I would have headed straight for a London art school. And I would have worked very hard, 7 days a week in the school, and I would have gone to private views, and I would have cultivated friendships and connections in the London business world connected with the arts. And I would have, been absolutely ruthless in pursuing that goal. But as it was, I went to Wales. I went to a very, a sort of semi-rural college of the University College of Wales in Aberystwyth. I had a fantastic time. I met some great people, some great poets and writers, and that broadened my perspective on the arts, and actors as well. And I was at a bit of a loss, like many people are after art school. I kind of drifted around a bit. I moved around England. I went to Exeter. I ended up in Brighton. And I got involved in a group studio project down there called Red Herring, which was fantastic because there was a bunch of us together. We found an old building, or the guys that and the women that were involved originally with Red Herring had found this building. I got involved slightly later. But the great thing there was that I was working as part of a group, and we'd roll into the studios, we'd have a cup of tea, and then we'd go to our individual spaces and we'd try and make work. And all of our standards as artists were raised by the fact that we knew there were people around who were also trying very hard in their different styles and media. So that, I've always been involved in group studios right from leaving university. I got straight involved immediately with the group studio in Aberystwyth during my last year at uni, got out of the faculty and into my own studio because I wanted to work freely and without being watched and by the staff. When I left Aberystwyth, I went to Exeter, I had a studio, started a studio group there. And then moving to Brighton, there was a bigger and better studio group there, and I stayed there for 5 years, and then moved to Manchester, straight into another group studio. And I've been in 3 different studios since living in Manchester, and very fortunately for me, they've got bigger and better in terms of the facilities and space. And I've carried on making work. I've painted all through that period, probably about 38 years now. And as I said earlier, I started teaching about 15 years ago, and I've had a great experience teaching in further education now, higher education, in fine art. And because over the years I've taken on more and more responsibility at the studios in Manchester, I now have a subsidised space there as part of my remuneration for the responsibilities of being a director. So I've kind of very, very slowly, incrementally got myself into quite a good position in that I've got a large studio that's got wonderful natural light and a running source of running water. And it's subsidised by the group I'm involved with. And I've got plenty of ideas coming out of the PhD. And I've got some teaching, which keeps me in touch with how younger people are kind of trying to get started in this very, very strange pursuit that can, consume your entire life before you've even noticed it, So that's the broad potted history of where I'm from.
So the 15, you said, let me try and get this right. 15 years ago, was it you started teaching?
Yeah.
So what were you doing before you started teaching to earn a living?
Right. Good. Very good question.
You've been constantly painting throughout this period.
Yeah.
And for the last 15 years, you saw all the sort of aspects of your work, the practical running of the studios and things, as sort of paid dividends. But in that more unsubstantial period before this, what were you doing?
That's a really good question, and your forensic instinct for a kind of for a gap in the discourse, John, is really coming through there. Yeah, well, way back in Brighton, I had a part-time job cleaning for the Brighton Council in a large concert hall complex down there. So I was already kind of used in my 20s to the prospect of having to do anything. I mean, it wasn't a grim job by any means, but to do anything to keep my practice going. So that I'd be working 2, 3, maybe 4 days a week from 7 a.m. as a cleaner. And then I'd have the freedom to work evenings or maybe a couple of days and a weekend a week in my studio. So great, great. Living on very, very little money. And when I moved up to Manchester, I quickly realized that I couldn't just paint in my studio, I'd stopped signing on by that time, which I was relieved about. And I didn't want to go back to signing on. So I've never signed on unemployed in Manchester. I got a job in a bookshop on Deansgate, Waterstone's bookshop. And there was a very visionary guy running that bookshop at the time, a guy called Robert Topping, and he put me in the art book section. So I was enjoying myself looking at art books while selling them, and got lots of ideas from being immersed in all this literature. So I did various shifts at this bookshop for a long, long time, probably about 18 years, either full-time, they were very flexible. They allowed me to work part-time, full-time, any number of days a week. And that kept me going. That paid the bills. And fed into what I was doing. So I was very lucky, because you would get free samples from some of the reps. So you're able to take books home and you're able to gain a bit more of a solid understanding of the history of your medium just by reading this material. And I was able to rent myself, a bed sit, and I had the studio rent covered and some books as well. So, and living on dried pasta and tinned tuna, you can just about survive. I got very thin. I got a little bit ill at times. I got a bit cheesed off, a bit depressed. But, the other great thing about working in retail, sometimes there's some food and drink available if you have some kind of event in the shop. So I didn't want for a bit of amusement, a bit of entertainment as well. And it was great fellowship with the other people. Some of them were actors. There's been composers and actors, poets, all sorts of people, literary theorists, working part-time in bookshops who make life very interesting. So that, yeah. And then I got to the point where I was offered a bit of teaching by sheer luck, really, through people I knew who were by no means kind of in the management. They weren't kind of high-placed friends. They were just mates who got bits of teaching. And often opportunities come up in teaching at short notice, and you can get a bit of a fixed-term contract, perhaps, or a bit of cover. And I gradually got into the teaching from probably the we're around about 2003, 2005. And then that gradually replaced the retail. But I've always kept the painting going.
And imagine that your qualification for teaching was not just your own personal practice, but also, as you've described, getting a grounding in the field that you're working in through reading and research about other artists and what they do.
Yeah.
So am I right in thinking that essentially when you're teaching now, you're sharing the understanding you've developed over, not through your own personal practice and through your own research and investigations, that's what you're sharing with the students, is that right?
Yeah, to an extent. Again, it's slightly more complicated because you don't necessarily need a degree in art history to teach people, fine art. There's a historical, there's a theoretical, there's a practical element of most fine art courses. And obviously you need to be interested enough to research or learn or enhance your existing knowledge about something if you're going to then talk about, lecture about it. That's self-evident. And you've also got to, something I found, that you have to open up to the possibility of working in other media or investigating them to an extent, because you want to have a broad range of experience to bring to bear on the teaching. So, I don't by any means sort of try to coerce my students into painting. I know how difficult it is to make a decent painting from 40 years of experience. So if there are newer media where they can realize their ideas quicker and possibly cheaper, then I'll encourage them towards those media. So you don't necessarily need to know a shed load about art history or even the more difficult theories that have been concocted about art. You just need to be interested in art and a good communicator. You need to make it your mission to make the most complex and intractable sounding ideas totally transparent and assimilable for people. So, how does, modernist art theory translate into making work? How, where does theory and practice actually join? And that's the little bridge you need to build so that people can make work that's informed and literate. It's not just off the cuff. It's not just a copy of a photo of a kitten for your grandma at Christmas. It's something that carries some meaning in the culture as it exists today, So and that's another thing again, you need to investigate a lot of work by other artists that you wouldn't normally look at or be interested in, because you want to then bring that to bear on your teaching. Show the students the widest range of practice.
So yeah, it's given you a foundation, but you've had to develop that foundation in order to accommodate a range of different approaches that the students might be bringing.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you've given me really an answer already. I'm just going to summarize it and see if we can expand on it a bit. So currently your sort of working week involves some obviously not directly now with COVID-19. However, in a sort of state of normality, your working week would involve some administration tasks within the studio environment that you occupy.
Yeah.
Some teaching at the university that you work at.
Yeah.
Plus your own personal painting practice.
That's correct, yeah.
So how do you balance those three things?
Well, you have to be very fluid, if I'm at the studio and I'm trying to start a painting, or I'm midway through a painting and someone knocks on the door because their lights are fused, or there's a visit to the studios by a group of curators who want to be shown round, then I've got to plan, I've got to timetable it and fit it in, and I've got to, switch between total silent immersion in a very complex and difficult craft, which is painting, flick over into a sort of meet and greet mode, where I'm saying, hi, this is Rogue Studios. It was built in 1897, and it's et cetera, et cetera. And it can be difficult. And I would guess overall, it's possibly reduced the amount of painting time, the number of hours a week I can spend painting. But then, like I've said before, it's a worthwhile, pursuit to try to help to, expand and fortify the arts infrastructure of this region, but, by offering studio space to emerging or mid-career artists. It's a worthwhile pursuit. It's something myself and the other director are very proud of having held together through 25 years, really. So it's not that I'm cursing under my breath when I have to stop painting to show someone around or show where the meters are to the, electricity guy. It's part of the life. It's part of the job. But at the same time, I've got a better studio than I've ever had. I've got my dream studio, the one I've dreamt of since I was 13. So, it's up to me to rise to that challenge and to work even harder, given that all the external requirements of my craft have now been answered for me, have now been provided. But and then the teaching tends to occupy full days. So when you get up at 7 or whatever it is, you're on that train, or you would have been, and it would have been, again, it's a social experience, and it's young people who are interested in the arts, and colleagues who are compelled and passionate about what they do. So it's not like digging trenches in a third world country. It's not arduous and deeply unpleasant and disturbing and life-threatening work. It's fantastic to be involved in any capacity. I'm just absolutely delighted and thrilled that I've spent my entire life mixing up, those sorts of things. But there's no doubt that, the painting is what gives me the profound sense of, self-realization and satisfaction. That's the thing that really, if I haven't completed a painting recently, I start to kind of diminish as a personality,
Yeah, it's an expression of who you are, and if you're not able to fulfill it, then it feels.
But it also tells you more about who you are all the time. It's not like it doesn't just tell you who you've been up to that point. It tells you who you could be and what you could be interested in next. And, it's tremendously therapeutic, apart from anything else. It's not just therapy, obviously. It's very, very challenging. But it gets you through tough times and difficult situations. And it's rewarding because it's so difficult, So
I just want to emphasize, really, from what I'm taking from what you're saying, is that you've talked about working in the bookshop for 18 years, was it?
At least, yeah.
Right. So, but you've discussed it in very positive terms of what you actually gained from it, and you also talked about having been in a studio since your final year of university,
in
the 80s. So both of those things have paid dividends, haven't they? Because one of them has fed into your current teaching role, and the other one has fed into your director role within the studio.
Yeah.
So I suppose if we were to rewind back, actually, both of those things were building up to the situation you ultimately wanted to be in, even if it was unconscious at that time.
Yeah, that's the case. I think some of them felt like outlying decisions, that weren't strictly relevant to where I wanted to be. Like getting a job in a shop, it could have been any shop, really. But I heard that this recently opened bookstore was looking for people, or that people were finding work there. So I thought, well, I'll try there first. And I remember when I lived in Exeter after leaving university, I remember in those days, the unemployment used to ask you what you'd ideally like to do if they could find you a job. It was very different to today, obviously.
Yeah.
And I always used to put down library assistant, partly because I wanted to work with books, because I thought that would be civilized, and engaging. And partly because I thought it would probably reduce my chances of getting employment, and I'd be able to sign on for longer and keep painting. But, it was always like a fallback thing. I love reading. I love the literary arts. I got even more involved working in Waterstones in Deansgate, Manchester. I, attended a lot of author readings and met a lot of authors, went out with them and discussed what they were doing with them. Maybe unlike some visual artists, I'm more at home perhaps with writers than other artists. So, and that in turn fed into my working concerns, because I'm involved loosely with something called history painting, which really went out of fashion in the mid 19th century as a sort of style, or what they call a genre of painting. It went out of fashion because it was seen to be kind of polluted by political kind of agendas. And with modernism, it kind of died out, but it was also criticized as being an overtly literary sort of form of visual art. But I've never had a problem with paintings that tell stories. Some of my favorite paintings are paintings that are full of incident and tend to sort of stimulate the production of narrative in your mind. Like Frith, the famous Victorian British painter Frith, who painted all sorts of crowded fairground and station scenes that are absolutely glorious to look into and imagine stories around. So I never had a problem with painting that was literary, and I never really responded to modernism. So I was at home in a bookshop, and then I'd go to the studio and I'd have loads of books open in the studio, of old master painters and modernist painters, and I'd work freely inspired by these books, these artists. And that's part of that thing where I was always aware that I was working against the grain of what you were supposed to be looking at as a contemporary artist during the 80s, 90s and noughties even. You know, and now it's changed slightly. So there's more of a plurality in the arts scene. You know, you are licensed in effect to do any kind of work on any kind of subject matter using any medium or combination of media. So it's much freer in a way now. But I'm not claiming I was a pioneer or a forerunner of that development. But I've never understood why, if you're going to give yourself a hard time by being an artist, why would you then want to paint what everyone else is painting? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it sounds like you've taken that philosophy into your own personal teaching practice as well, by expanding out your understanding of what the potentialities are, so that you can facilitate those within your students.
Yeah, and I've probably given more decent ideas away than I've used in my own work. You know, and it's a strange thing, probably a failing on my part, that I'm very open to the full range of contemporary practice, but I'd still choose to make oil paintings on canvas myself. You know, I've never been excited enough by the potential of any other medium to use it myself, with one or two exceptions. But, you know, there's something about seeing a young artist developing, you know, and making creative decisions about media and about scale and subject matter that you couldn't help but be taken up by that enthusiasm that they have, and inspired yourself to just make a few suggestions, you know, and point at a few interesting artists to look at. But yeah, I don't often take my own advice. I just keep working, and the practice shifts and changes very, very slowly over decades.
Right.
Whether or not that's a good thing or not, I don't know. You know.
So, moving on, you've got plenty to look back on, and it's quite nice hearing how you talk about your past experience, because you generally have mined all the sort of areas that you could perceive as negative, i.e. not having much money,
Yeah,
for example, but you've drawn the positives out of them. So the two questions, so I'll let you think about them both together. What would you classify as one of the highlights up to now, but also one of the lowlights? So one of the things that you found really challenging.
Okay. Well, I'll give you a concrete example of a highlight. From about 8-10 years ago, I got hold of an album of photographs in a German flea market. I just bought it, or someone bought it for me, I think, because they knew I was working with old snapshots. They bought me this album, and in the album, all the photos were taken in East Germany before the wall was built. And there's a young woman in the photographs with a father and a mother and an extended family in various situations in the garden, in the house. And I got fascinated by this, partly because of the quality of the photos. The photos were kind of nostalgic looking. There were some interiors that had no figures, no people in them, which were very atmospheric, you know, with light streaming in through windows onto old furniture. But then the photos of the people were fascinating as well. And it turned out that the photographs were taken in a particular small town in East Germany in the late 50s. And some neighbours of mine in Old Trafford, where I live, came from that town or nearby. I just got talking to them over some dinner one night about what I was doing, you know, as an artist, and I mentioned this album. They said, "Oh, we're from East Germany. We're from near there, you know." And they were able to put me in touch with the person who lives in the house now that was in the photographs from the 1950s. This guy was a dentist, a living dentist these days, who'd taken on the house from the doctor in the photo album. So I wrote to the dentist, and he put me in touch with the woman in the photo album, who he had kept in touch with, and who is now in a nursing home near Frankfurt. So over the course of several months of corresponding, emailing and writing to the family of this woman, I was able to arrange to go over to Frankfurt and to give her the album back. By the time I went to Frankfurt, I'd painted 30-odd paintings from the photos in the album. So I took photographs of the paintings of the photographs with me, you know. And I also did a little portrait of her because she sent me an image of herself. I did a little painting to give her as a present. And I went and filmed an interview with her in this retirement home near Frankfurt. And she was looking through the album, which it turned out she'd never seen, because she moved to West Germany. And then the wall got built and she was cut off from her parents for a number of years. And she'd never been given this album or seen this album of photos her father had compiled. So to meet her and to hear her stories of growing up in the East, moving to the West, and then reunification of Germany, you know, and making the little film, that was an intensely magical project for me. That was the whole point of what I was trying to do up to that point, and still now to this day, really. You know, to make work that has a real meaning for at least one person. You know, I don't care how small the audience is. If it links back to life, if your work in your studio connects somehow with lived experience, and that lived experience is sufficiently interesting to have wider resonance and implications, like living in a totalitarian regime and escaping from it or whatever, or, you know, however you want to read the history, then that's my ideal kind of project. So that was a crystalline thing that became the model for subsequent projects and groups of paintings and exhibitions I've had since then. So that was kind of like a high point. And the sort of magical existential high point of that was when I got into this retirement home and I met this wonderful woman who'd been in these photos from the 50s. I met her with a friend from the retirement home, and he translated our dialogue together. But I'd prior to that, I'd done loads of paintings of her living room as a kid with the fixtures and fittings in that room from the album. And when I looked around her flat, all those fixtures and fittings, the sideboards, the lampshades were as they were. They were the same lampshades and furniture. So I had this weird out-of-body experience of having painted them really carefully. I was now seeing them for real in this woman's flat, you know. And obviously it was 60 years on from when those photos were taken, and she was still alive. And she was a fantastic character, full of life, you know, really welcoming and hospitable and fantastic. So that was just a great experience, really. So that would be the high point so far.
Yeah, well, it sounds pretty good. Just tell us a bit more about her response, because it must be a weird experience for her.
It was a weird experience, yeah. And at that point, I wasn't really up to speed with the moral and ethical implications of research, of my kind of research as an artist doing a PhD at that time, you know. So I should have really taken into account that this could have quite an extreme effect on her, potentially, as a woman in her early 80s. But the family had agreed to it, and the family were involved in the preparations for the visit, and she wanted to meet me, and she wanted to see the paintings I'd done, and she wanted to discuss the album and look through it, you know. So I went on their feeling that this was going to be okay, and it was okay, and it was a great encounter, and I sent her a huge bouquet of flowers afterwards, and the translator as well, he got one. And I thought that was it, you know, that I'd resolved it. I had a few questions I forgot to ask her when I started to write to her again after I got back to England. But I had a letter from the family saying we would prefer it now if contact was broken, because she's had a bit of a health incident. Her health has relapsed somewhat, possibly as a result of the overstimulation of all this, you know, this encounter with me. So I had no more contact with the family, and I'm not sure what the outcome of that story was. I'm hoping she recovered fully. But I'm very aware now that if you're going to work with people's snapshots, however you've obtained them, you need to make sure that you've done your very best to contact the people in the photos or the people who took the photos. You know, that's the risk of that kind of practice, but it's also the thing that motivates me, because I'm making work about people's lives, actual lived experience, you know, through the medium of photography. So yeah, I'm hoping she recovered fully, but I don't know for sure. And that's a really alarming thought at sometimes. And others I can think, well, she was delighted to see the paintings and thrilled to see the album. And I left the album with her. So I gave her the album and all the photos I had and the cuttings about her father's career that were tucked in the back of the album. So I did my best at the time, you know.
So what about the opposite end of the spectrum? The low or the most circumstances that you've endured or had to deal with?
A lot of failure, John.
Made.
A lot of failure, you know, a lot of rebuffs, a lot of reject letters. Every few years, I think I ought to apply for exhibitions all around the country or abroad, or I should apply for opportunities, or I should apply for fellowships or funding. I should try and get involved with institutions that may support the arts, you know. And I have a very fat folder full of reject letters, which I've since turned into a lecture, you know, and called Failure, which I give to the students if I'm short of a talk at some point in the university year. And I do it as a kind of, you know, how not to be an artist sort of thing, you know, because mistakes are really valuable. You know, if you don't make mistakes, you're not trying hard enough, you know, with what you're doing. You're only going to learn when it goes wrong. And if you think of mistakes as kind of chicanes you haven't driven into, you end up on that narrow, straight track into the future that you want to be on, you know, because you've avoided these sandbanks on either side, these bunkers. But I mean, when I first moved to Manchester, after an initial burst of painting for about 6 months, I got the job in the bookshop part-time, and, you know, money ran out. Rent was, you know, taking up most of what I earned. I had enough food for 2 weeks out of the month. So the rest of the month I had to kind of cycle around and drop in on friends round about tea time, hoping they'd feed me, you know. And that kind of way of living had gone on in Brighton as well. And I've got vivid images of friends turning out their pockets to lend me a couple of quid just to get through the rest of the day, you know. And that was in Brighton, and then in Manchester that carried on happening until the teaching, you know. So prolonged periods of kind of like not really enough to eat, certainly no going out drinking pints, no trips to the cinema, no holiday, absolutely no holidays. I've painted on Christmas Day right through every public holiday, weekends, evenings, through till 1 or 2 in the morning, you know. I've not had the social life that I'm guessing people in better paid professions will perhaps have enjoyed, you know. But then maybe I'm you know, that's again a temperamental thing. Maybe I'm, you know, antisocial or something. You'd have to work out for yourself as a young artist, you know, do you need company? Well, then maybe try and channel your creativity into something that's a group effort, like a theatre or a dance or performative sort of medium. If you don't mind being on your own for virtually the whole week, you know, then painting may be a good option. But you'd have to think very carefully. And you obviously you're entitled to make lots of changes in your 20s. You don't need to, if you want a life in the arts, you know, you can spend your time working out which art form answers your basic needs as an individual, really.
But being poor, essentially, for a significant and extended period is one of the costs, you know, if we're going to talk about in financial terms, to the career choice you've made.
Yeah, but you're incredibly rich in one way, aren't you? Because you've got total creative freedom. Most days of the week, maybe, you're able to get up, go where you want to go and do what you want to do and have the thoughts you want to have. And you can make work quite cheaply with a few sheets of A4 paper and a pencil. You know, you can work out stuff. Or if you've got a cheap laptop and you're a digital artist, you can work away for hour after hour, especially when you're young, on just a sandwich. So, you know what I mean? You're rich. You're incredibly rich in terms of the potential and the creativity you can develop in yourself. You're just not cash rich. Yeah. You know, and for the people who throw themselves into, I don't know, business courses or, you know, marketing courses and decide from very early age that they want a big income and they want, you know, the double garage and the 2 cars and the big family, then you've got to pick the form of activity that's going to bring you that what you want. But I'm not under any illusion that high-flying businessmen, you know, don't work incredibly hard and aren't creative in what they do. But I'm guessing that some of them feel that they maybe could have done something a bit more profoundly satisfying than having to spend all day, every day looking at, you know, chasing up invoices or whatever. Or, yeah. You know, there's a huge spectrum of employment out there. Even now, you know, things you could start up and get going that you would have so much joy in doing that you wouldn't notice the deprivation while you were struggling to get it going. You know?
All right. So there's 2 more questions. And the first one is, whereabouts or what direction are you currently thinking about taking your work into? You know, where are you at the moment as an artist? what are you thinking about?
Well, I'm just thinking, obviously, first and foremost, that the world may not be the same when we emerge from this crisis. So chances are there'll be far fewer opportunities, and exhibiting will be difficult, and there won't be as much cash about. So I dare say that whatever I say now will be modulated or adjusted by how things are next year and beyond. But I'm just going to carry on. If I can afford it, I'm going to carry on painting. I'm going to carry on acquiring material that I find interesting to work with. I'm going to carry on looking for the historical context in that material, maybe going to the places the photos were taken, trying to trace the people in them, if there's inscriptions on that material, any clues. I love that historical detective work that goes with a project. And in between those bigger projects, I'll just do individual bits and pieces here and there, maybe try a few new media. Just carry on in the direction that this recent period of study has given me, but keep an open mind to how it might completely transform on the basis that circumstances have changed for everybody, and it may take on a completely different form. I'd like to make more films. I'd like to be a lot better at making films. A lot of the snapshots I work from are black and white, so I've been working in monochrome for a long time, and film work is a way of welcoming color back into your palette, because you can shoot in color, obviously, and you can think much more about color while putting something together with film. So I'm hoping to just be able to carry on, and it's a strange time when you hit 60. You do take stock of it, even if you're not locked down. You do look back and wonder where you should go next. But I think it could be a bit of a mistake to kind of try and work out where to go next from looking back. You know what I mean? I think you've got to stay open and forward facing. Otherwise, you can end up as a kind of a small scale version of yourself, working to your strengths and avoiding risk. So open mind and carry on trying to take as much in as possible, and just stay motivated. Never give up. That's my advice.
So you've to link back to what you were saying previously, you've also got a method for facilitating that, haven't you? Because if you work, it opens you up to new ideas, and those ideas you can take your work down within new directions. So the process of working is actually the process of where you take your work, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit like pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. It's that idea, which is...
It's not separate. I think what I'm reflecting on is I've got a tendency to separate out what you're doing now and what you're going to do as though they're two different things. And really what you're reiterating is the process of doing the work is what develops it and takes it off in new directions, and it takes you off in new directions. You're not separate from the work, and the work's not separate from you.
Yeah. I think I've managed to pull a trick on myself to get round a tremendous laziness on my part. And the trick is, when you think you want to do something or make something, you get fixated on it, and it becomes kind of overdetermined. You put too much in, it's too important, too central to you. So I've worked out that if I can kind of do things out of the corner of my eye somehow, or trick myself into doing things without thinking I'm doing them, it works a lot better for me. So when I realized there was nobody making me paint from life, paint from people in front of me, or objects or things or places in front of me, when I realized there was no law against working from photos, and God knows I was late enough realizing that, because photorealism has been around since the 60s, But when I realized that I could work with other people's photos, it was a revelation, because I've been collecting them anyway at flea markets and boot fairs and junk shops. I was just fascinated to see people in old bathing costumes or doing crazy stuff in foreign cities. And because I'm always doing that, every time I look at the piles of photos I've accumulated, I get new ideas for making paintings. So it's the collecting habit that generates the ideas, not me sitting alone in a darkened room, agonizing over what to paint next, And the way when I'm in the studio, the way I get myself to work is I just think of it as, I'm just copying this old photo. That's all. I don't sort of glamorize it or romanticize it or big it up to myself. I'm doing something very, very simple and basic and manual. You know, so when I'm interrupted, people knock on that door, I'm not upset. You're not in torments of creative agony. You're just manually copying something to the best of your ability. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it's okay, you know. So it's finding ways of kidding yourself that what you're doing isn't the be all and end all, or isn't critical. You know, it's not life or death. If you can kid yourself that way, it makes it easier to carry on. And I've always thought that, you know, I think John Lennon said something about how life is something that happens out of the corner of your eye, the peripheral vision. It's not what you're fixated on that counts, you know. It's the thing off to one side that you scarcely notice that ends up having the central significance for you. And I think that's how I've tried to kind of keep my work going.
Well, you've been successful in that, haven't you?
Well, I've done a lot. I don't know whether success is the word.
Right, you've been successfully doing a lot. Let's put it
Yeah.
like that. So, last question. You know, because like you said, pushing 60, it is a natural time to sort of look back and reflect whether you want to do that or not. And if you do actually engage with younger people who have decided that they want to explore a career in the arts. So what sort of advice would you, it'd have to be generic, obviously, because you don't have a younger person here asking you the question. You've got me suggesting that you might have some universal insights that you can deploy.
I've got to be very diplomatic because there's several shades of honesty you can employ when you're talking about this. You know what I mean? There's the university approved, career advice. And then there's the reality of the art world and how it works, if there is an art world.
Yeah.
And then there's somewhere in between which is roughly how you've negotiated it. So, you can either talk about what you think you need to do to be a huge star in a field, judged based on what you've glimpsed of how people are who've become huge stars, you know, or there's how you've managed to swing it, or there's the cynical, you know, it's not what you know, it's who you know kind of end of the spectrum. So if I stay in the middle somewhere.
But it's about you and your experience is real lived experience, isn't it, that nobody else has got.
Yeah.
So really that's the thing of value that you can bring to the table.
Well, okay, I've got a few things, a few tenets, you know, a few principles I stick by. You know, if you want to make a really healthy living, don't go into the creative arts. Not because you won't make a living, but because if you're thinking about money first, you're not invested enough in the creativity. You should be so obsessed with the art form you're involved in that you're not interested in money. You're not interested in anything else. This is when you're young now, yeah? Possibly still living with your parents or...
Yeah. So this is aimed at a younger person.
Yeah. I mean, I know everyone has to make a living. I'm not being naive, but if you're still living at home or you're contemplating a university career or you're thinking after university, how can I keep this going? Club together with other people that you get on with who are involved in something similar and stick together. Have regular get-togethers. Try to find, if you need a premises, like a place to go that's not your flat or your bedsit, try and go through the property agents' online portfolios, look around the streets, look for empty rooms above shops or buildings that appear to be unused, semi-derelict even. Get together and organize yourselves into a studio group. However many of you there are, 3 up to 30 or 80 or 90 like we've got. And the strength in numbers. You can attract more opportunities to yourself if you're with other people working in a range of approaches who are they've all got their little constituency of their parents and mates, who they can bring in to some kind of party or launch or exhibition opening. So club, get together, find a little premises if you can. If you can cover the rent when you divide it up between you, that's great. Keep it going as long as you can. Take turns to clean the toilets out, sort the bins. Make sure that you've got a little operating surplus so your rent adds up to more than your outgoing costs. So if there's an emergency, like a hole in the roof, you can get it patched. And when you've got your little place to work, however small and pokey and grim it is, whether it's got running water or heating or whatever it is, keep working. work away at what you're doing and get out as much as you can socially on the scene of other people trying to do that stuff, because you learn quicker by looking at other people's work than any number of lectures or books will teach you. So get out and about, talk to people. Most exhibition openings in public or private venues are free to go to. There might be some refreshments. You might get a bit of food, I mean, don't, grab all the stuff off the table and stuff it down your throat because you're starving to death. Just try and be a little bit cool. But grab yourself a wine or an orange juice, whatever, and just hover on the edges of conversation, maybe make eye contact. If you talk to one person on the first time you go, count that as a massive achievement. You don't need to take your Facebook details or your contact. As long as you're becoming familiar around and about, wherever you are in the country, get involved in your local arts scene. And if there's little open exhibition opportunities, where someone's doing a show and you can apply to be in it, send a JPEG or, put £5 forwards for the admin fee, go for that. Support local artist-led projects and like Rogue or like Paradise Works in Salford or Neo Artists in Bolton. Get involved, go and talk to people. However old or established they are, most artists will respond to emails or chat to you if you're friendly with them, So gather as much experience as you can by chatting to people and just and make your work, do your very best to make your work. Take a cleaning job if you have to do anything, shop work, just keep it going, never give up. And, as I say, this is a life in the arts. It's a different course for people who are hell-bent on celebrity status in the arts. You have to do different stuff. You have to make friends where your career interests lie exclusively. Now, that's something I could never do. I could never try to get to know someone or become their friend just because they can help my career. That's anathema to me. That's the line I can't cross. And so as soon as there's a line like that for the majority of people, I'm guessing are similar to me, perhaps they're not, that line becomes the dividing line between the high flyers and the rest, And I'm in the rest. I'm amongst the rest, and I'm proud of that because I'm satisfied with the contribution I've made. So, and I've preserved that creative freedom. So if you're young and you're in with your mates and you've got a little building, or maybe you're working from home, go in for the competitions, scour the internet for opportunities and stick at it and try and get better and better. The longer you work, the better you get. That 30,000 hours thing is right. It's about right. You need to do it for a lot of the time, as much of the time as you can. And, it's a great life. It's a fantastic life. I mean, there are things about it that are unsettling or disturbing sometimes. You might feel isolated. You might feel, you're going a bit crazy getting your ideas onto paper or onto tape or whatever, onto your MP3. You might find that you're too self-involved, and then break off from time to time and talk to people, look at other people's work, attend talks, free talks by artists. Don't get too obsessive while you're working that hard, because it can have a bad effect. Too much isolation isn't good. But if you can avoid the pitfalls and stay positive and stay connected socially, I think it's a great life for anyone who goes for it.
So, following on the theme that you've been sort of promoting there, if anybody's listening to this and they would like to, just pick your brains a bit more and get in touch with you, would you encourage them to do that?
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, you can put my email or website on the end of this. I work at the University of Bolton. I'm at Rogue Artist Studios. There are websites for virtually everywhere I go. My website, www.davidgledhill.com. Dip into that, look at the projects, and contact me through that if you want to. But if anyone wants advice, I'm employed to do it part of the week, so I may as well carry on. But I can't really speak for theatre or music, or if you're a writer, if you want to be a novelist, you need to spend maybe more time alone. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's your field.
It's my field, yeah.
Particular experience and knowledge, and that's what's, I think, valuable.
Yeah. But even if you're writing and you need to be alone 8 hours a day, make sure you get out and socialise and talk to other practitioners across the board,
So finally, there's the opportunity to put an image on the link for this, so people can hear your story, but an image that might give them an idea about what you're about.
Yeah.
Have you got an idea what you would like to put up?
I've got an image that somebody took of me in the studio, and I'm sat on a stool in front of a painting I'm working on, but I'm laughing. I can't remember. Somebody said something funny, so I'm kind of on my own, but I'm laughing. And that maybe that sums it up, really. You know, it could be a crazy laugh, or it could be a laugh of joy at having all that personal liberty, you know, to be an artist. The only thing I ever wanted to be from the age of 5 or 6, you know. So that's the one I'll put up, John.
Okay, fantastic.
Do you want me to send that to you?
Yeah, if you send it to me, and it's going out on Saturday, so we've got a little bit of time.
Okay.
All right. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
Really much appreciated.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you. It always is. It was a real pleasure.
All right. Thanks very much,
All
Dave.
right. See you soon.